Here for tonight's topic, how can technology enhance social connection during a pandemic? Before we get started, I wanted to say just a tiny bit about the center. We've been around UC Santa Cruz for about 10 years now, and our mission is to innovate technology practices and platforms to enhance everyday lived human experience. And we draw upon the unique strengths and sensibilities of UC Santa Cruz. I've got a little looping video behind me of some of the natural splendor of this place, which are a deep concern for well-being and social good, closeness to and respect for the natural world, as well as technological skill, with Silicon Valley less than an hour away. The center got started with a focus on games and playable media, and that's really deep in our DNA. And you'll see that in the panel tonight. Our researchers bring a playful sensibility to the work that they do. But the center's mission encompasses a broad range of computationally enabled activities, from virtual reality stroke rehab to apps that help users track and manage mood, to wearables for assisting conversational balance, to work at the intersection of data viz and machine learning. I'll paste the URL for the center into the chat now so that you can peruse our range of research projects and faculty. Or actually, maybe I'll have, let's see, all panelists and attendees. Here we go. So there you go. Before we dive into the program, just a couple of logistical notes. You can type questions into the text chat throughout the speaker's brief 7-minute presentations. We'll address any urgent clarification questions in between speakers, but otherwise we'll hold off on the major Q&A until we've seen all 3 presentations, so you have a sense of the scope of the themes of the talks. And myself and our center administrator here, Jonathan Morales-Rocha, will try to make sure we cover all the questions. After we've had some initial discussion, we'll also be trying out a different way to mingle and discuss. So Jonathan has prepared a Mozilla Hubs room, and I believe he's pre-sent that link to you all, and we'll also put it in the chat when we're ready to transition. So after a little bit of our discussion, we'll have an optional piece where we move over to Hubs. And when you go there, you'll be in a virtual space with your own avatar. And the panelists will be there too, and their slides will be mounted on the wall so you can page through them to support your conversation. So we hope you'll stick around to try that out as well, to see how it feels in contrast to being in a video chat. Okay, so let's get started with the panelists' brief talks. The first person to speak is Jared Duval. Jared is a PhD student in UC Santa Cruz's Computational Media Department. He's studying under Sri Kurniawan in the Assist Lab and also working with myself in the SET Lab. And as he puts it so well, he's a therapy game creator and a play chaser. And he'll be speaking to us about social games and a healthier tomorrow. So take it away, Jared.
Great, thank you so much, Catherine, for the introduction. As Catherine pointed out, I'm going to be talking a little bit today about how social play and tech can support health during a pandemic. And the first thing I want to get us all on board with is how play can be a natural vehicle for improving health. Play teaches us dynamic skills that enhance physical, social, emotional development. Play can motivate us to continue improving our health because it's fun to play. Unstructured play gives us an opportunity to discover ourselves and make connections with the world around us. And healing often requires us to try new things. And one thing we also know about play is it's used very often in, it's very often social. Play and healing are both very often social. And people who play include medical professionals, teachers, siblings, guardians, and community members. They often use play as a tool to help with their outcomes. So one thing we know about the quarantine is it can make us feel isolated. This pandemic is isolating. So with so many people practicing social distancing, we began looking for ways to reconnect. And the obvious solution was to use technology to stay connected while social distancing. And people have gotten really creative on how we can use tech to bring us together during the pandemic, such as doing virtual concerts, visiting museums and learning online, and exploring the world virtually. And some of the really ways we're using tech, the really interesting ways we're using tech to be connected socially will be talked about in the future panelists. So all of these have some successes, but one area that is particularly challenging is in therapy and rehabilitation. And there's a few reasons for that. Medical professionals are focused on treating COVID instead of on non-essential therapies. Patients are afraid to visit medical facilities because they have an increased traffic of infection. And they've instead opted to connect with medical professionals virtually, which supports the need of the development of more telehealth solutions. And a telehealth solution is basically a technology that helps us scale access to medical care. They often use data and sensing technologies to measure patient progress, provide feedback, and provide actionable insights about performance both to users and to medical professionals. So, which brings me to my research, which is telehealth solutions that are playful, social, and support specific therapies during quarantine. And I'm going to very briefly share 3 of them with you today. The first is Spoke It. Spoke It is a speech therapy game for children with cleft speech, and it's an app that is going to be available very soon on the App Store for iOS devices. It uses critical speech recognition systems to analyze the player's speech and rewards them for saying words correctly and gives them help on how to say words correctly that it picks up on where there could be improvements. So I'm going to show you a brief little video.
Spoke It is a game that is aimed to help children with speech impairment to practice speech therapy at their own home. Speech therapy is an important step in recovery after receiving cleft surgery.
Keep in mind that I can only be powered by speech.
The way Spoke It is played is entirely by speech, so you never have to touch the device. And basically, it follows an overarching narrative with a whole bunch of mini games inside, and each mini game focuses on a specific type of speech therapy. Spoke It is exciting because it has the potential to really create a healthcare solution for children who need speech therapy and don't have access to it normally.
SmileTrain and their experts are providing us advices how to make Spoke It to be more culturally and language-wise appropriate for children around the world.
SmileTrain is so excited to work with Spoke It on this because so many of our children and the families around the world that we work with do not live near a speech therapist that can help them.
Facilitating speech therapy is very difficult. We wanted to provide support at home where parents might be busy or might have a hard time leading a speech therapy curriculum.
So I'm not sure how my internet is doing. If there were parts of the video that cut out or anything like that, feel free to browse it in the Mozilla rooms that we'll be visiting later. But what's really exciting about Spoke It right now is we're working on creating cultural probes to send home to families during the pandemic, so that way they can practice their speech therapy, because a cultural probe is basically a resource that we can give people. But the way they use the cultural probes will provide us research data on how to improve the game so that way it can be more useful during the pandemic itself. So that's one way we are enhancing social connection during a pandemic, is making therapy work at home and work well in the family setting. So that's Spoke It. The next game I want to talk about is Circus. And Circus is a collaboration with Uppsala University in Sweden. And it's a game for children with sensory-based motor disorder. And sensory-based motor disorder is a sort of new diagnosis. And the easiest way to describe it is sort of the children who are a little bit more uncoordinated, maybe a little bit weaker, have more problems with balance. And the goal of this game is to have children use their bodies and to build strength, balance, and those skills. And the way it works is it's an app that sits in your pocket, so it's very non-screen centric, and it uses machine learning to analyze the way you're moving and categorize the animal you're moving like. And it's all connected to a bunch of other players in the room, so it's a multiplayer game, and it allows them to act like animals, which is something that they've really loved doing in our studies and in the work done by the Swedish group. So that's Circus. And finally, is spellcasters. And I'm going to mute spellcasters. So spellcasters is a game that was originally made to be fun. And it is made entirely for entertainment. And the way it works is it's a magical duel between 5 players on each team, and each team has a pool of lives, and you're basically battling the other team and trying to be the last team standing. And the way the system works is you have this wand in your hand and you cast these gestures to indicate which spell you want to cast next, and then you point and shoot. And what's cool about this game was it was made to be for entertainment at first, but we figured, what happens if you put that wand in the stroke survivor's weaker hand and made those gestures therapeutic to them? So again, this is a multiplayer social game where people are visiting VR, and it's providing a fun way to do your stroke rehabilitation exercises. So those are the 3 games that I wanted to briefly touch on today. I could talk for a long time about them, but I hope you guys chat more with me later on, and I will take any pressing questions, but we'll leave the rest of the questions till the end of the panel.
That was great. Thank you, Jared. So I don't know, Jonathan, I'm not seeing any pressing clarification questions. So I think that we will go ahead and move on to our next panelist. So I am delighted to introduce Elizabeth Swensen. She's an assistant professor of art and design, games, and playable media here at UC Santa Cruz. She came to us with an MFA from USC's very well-regarded interactive media program. And Elizabeth focuses on designing narrative for interactive experiences, system design for playful learning, and experimental tabletop RPG design. And she's going to be speaking to us tonight about physical and dynamic simulation in distance, tabletop, and embodied play, or, as she puts it in her alternate title, how board games are surviving the pandemic. Take it away, Elizabeth.
Excellent. Thanks, Catherine. I'm going to pull my slides up really quick and share my screen with you all. And I'm going to be brave and turn on closed captioning in case any of you have a housemate who's vacuuming right now. So as Catherine introduced, I'll be talking about the way board games are surviving the pandemic and some approaches to embracing distanced play when we're used to it being physical or embodied. And yes, my name is Elizabeth Swensen. I teach in 2 programs here at UCSC, primarily art and design, games, and playable media, but I also teach in the digital arts and new media MFA program. Now, a lot of my practice is digital. I do make digital games, but another huge part of what I do is on the table or in real physical space, whether it's a board game, a card game, some kind of role-playing experience or installation-based experience that we might classify as big games, which very loosely means people playing together in space, sometimes with props or some other site-specific build-out. And like many industries, I found that my research in this area has begun to falter in our new reality. So part of my curiosity as a designer is to play with constraints and certainly see how other forces and market factors are responding to those same constraints. So early in the pandemic, as you might expect, there was an increase in online digital game playing and also the sales of digital games. But thinking about what's more difficult in this pandemic, thinking about physical games, I was surprised to see an increase in board games and puzzles and cats on Zoom calls. And also in my interest area are the increase in activity on tools that have already exist to assist people who want to play at a distance. For example, in this, one of many sources is Fantasy Grounds, which is a service that does that. And so with that curiosity, I began to sort of follow it as both a consumer of these experiences and a designer of these experiences, seeing how these companies are dealing with capturing this very difficult thing, which is this lovely social experience of friends around the table dealing with physical objects and playing games. There are a number of approaches, and before I go much further, I want to suggest that you check out an upcoming master's thesis from the Computational Media Department by the student Mirek Stoli. He's very interested in digital adaptation and augmentation, and while I'm mostly directing my sort of energy and exploration to the pandemic and what we're seeing in this moment in time, he has a very detailed look and study of these various approaches. So check out his work. The first technique I'm seeing is looking at the familiar experience of people on a table manipulating physical objects. And you may have heard of something like Tabletop Simulator, which gives you a 3D physics-enabled environment to play board games at a distance. It's existed before the pandemic, but again, seeing increase in usage now. The benefits is in the exactness of that simulation. You can move your pieces, you can draw your cards, but the game is really interested in you directing that action, you telling who's next, you telling sort of what's allowed and what isn't allowed. And you see multiple competing products in this space, another being Tabletopia, which while abstracting out the location or the potential for backgrounds and environments, still at its heart is a physics simulation of these objects in space. It's a broad approach that, given the art assets, which is no small thing, but doesn't require the specific programming to make or adjudicate this for other players that some other practices will use that we'll see later in the slides. More interesting or more unusual is in the space of escape rooms. And for those who haven't experienced them or heard of them before, escape rooms are a big phenomenon these days in terms of almost replicating a video game-like puzzle experience. You are in a physical room with your friends or with some strangers and asked to complete a series of puzzles. Sometimes these puzzles are abstract, but typically they're under a time limit and often dressed up to follow a story. And one sort of approach in these replicating the physical object pieces would be something like You Escape, where they're taking the actual physical puzzle objects that we'd see in an escape room, putting a webcam in front of it, and having players at a distance direct the hands of some kind of moderator, trying to capture what we remember of that physical experience. But I think I tend to be more interested in experiences looking to capture some of the feelings of the systems themselves rather than enact the exact physical experience, just because it's never going to be quite the same to move a piece for me on something like Tabletop Simulator as it is to hold a piece and fiddle with it while I'm thinking and waiting for my turn in real life. So in the sort of simple and yet still difficult approach, you'll see an increase in sales and focus on these very specific software approaches to these board games. Scythe, for example, exists in Tabletopia, exists in Tabletop Simulator, but there's a standalone app that offloads some of the learning that the player otherwise would need to know what can I do in this moment and who goes next. The software is helping us learn this game. And if I have time for a tangent later, I'm going to come back to this point. Also fascinating are tools that are trying to bring this distanced experience, but add something we wouldn't normally have, something like Roll20, which is augmenting the experience of playing tabletop RPGs like Dungeons and Dragons. And while it can simulate moving figures on a map, as you see here, I can also scroll back and see something that someone said or rolled 30 minutes ago. I have this memory that I wouldn't maybe normally have in front of me on a tabletop. I can also see this heads-up display. How much health does that enemy have? Here's this fog of war that's not impossible to do on a table, but certainly much easier to do in this digital space. So now we're getting something more than we had before. And then lastly, and most uniquely, using narrative as a way to make us feel closer together and feel like we're missing less. Again, back in the escape rooms, SCRAP is one of many escape room franchises. And you can see an example of one of their rooms to the right there that's a train puzzle. And you can imagine manipulating these physical objects and solving these problems and how much we would miss if we were doing this at a distance. And yet that same franchise is doing this escape from the alien research facility that uses the narrative conceit of a trapped researcher in the facility, and you are trying to help this researcher desperately over like a comm system. So you don't always see everything exactly. We're dealing with sound cues, her own panic, and occasionally some visual aids if there's a narrative conceit for you to be able to see into the space. So this very clever use of narrative makes us, maybe it's not quite the same as the physical experience, but we don't miss it because it feels intentional. So this is more of a thought space. As a designer, I'm excited about some of these solutions, even though they're made due to a necessity, something outside of our control. But I'm hoping that after the pandemic, we both acknowledge this existing desire to play with people who aren't next door, because it gives us flexibility, even with people within our own town. It gives a potential for added accessibility. Some things that normally are very difficult for everyone to do in a physical space might be able to be more accessible with the tools we have available to us using a few different kinds of technology. And then, of course, there's this opportunity to form strong connections through the affordances that we have with technology that are maybe different than the ones we get through physical contact and a high five, but still valuable nonetheless. Look forward to talking with you all more about this later.
Really nice, thought-provoking talk. I don't see any questions. Jonathan, is that correct? And then I think, if so, yeah. So we'll move on to our final panelist, Ferran. I'm not going to say his last name properly because I'm not Spanish. Ferran Altarriba Bertran. He's a playful interaction designer and currently also a computational media PhD candidate at UC Santa Cruz. His research includes the design of playful everyday technologies with a particular focus on human-food interaction. And tonight he'll be speaking to us about designing playful technology that connects us during mealtime. So please feel free to show us your slides. Thank you very much, Ferran.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine, for the introduction. Let me pull up my slides. Hello, everyone. My name is Ferran, and I'm a PhD student here at UC Santa Cruz. And today I'll talk a bit about my research into playful technology design. I'll talk about how technology can help us add an element of playfulness to our daily lives in ways that it enriches our routine socially and emotionally, which is something that I think is very important, and especially important in times of a pandemic. And I'm also going to introduce a project we're working on right now, where we're exploring how to design these kinds of playful technologies in the context of mealtime. So yeah, to give a bit of context about who I am and what I do, I'm an interaction designer who's very passionate about the potential of play to make our lives more fun and more exciting. So my research is quite focused on understanding what can play contribute to our daily routines and on figuring out mechanisms to design technology that leverages that potential. So generally, this is my research question: how can we design playful technologies and experiences that integrate well within our daily activities and routines? And this is a tricky question, because it means designing technologies and experiences that are not always necessarily games as we know them traditionally. The thing is, games are super cool and interesting and fun and relevant, but they're just one among many types of activities that we can consider playful. Play can take many other forms than games. For example, teasing one another during a meeting with friends, saying a joke during a business meeting, or sneakily stealing food from someone during a meal. And all of those are very desirable social-emotional experiences that technology could and perhaps should promote. And the interesting thing is that when we play a game, we're rather focused on the game activity, right? With little attention to our ordinary routines. When we stop playing, we transition back to normal, and that connection between gameplay and our daily routines and our daily lives sort of fades away quite a bit. But differently with other kinds of playful experiences, the overlap between play and our ordinary routines can be much bigger. That's one of the lovely things about play, I think, which is that it can permeate our lives anytime and anywhere, even when we're not playing games. And they generally will bring about positive outcomes. So my research explores this overlap between play and mundane activity. I'm very interested in learning how to design technologies that help us be more playful every day in our ordinary routines, in ways that it enriches our ordinary practices rather than disrupting them or shifting our attention away from them. And I do believe that this is a really important thing to consider today as technology keeps creeping into more and more areas of our lives. We need to think well about how we design computational media in ways that it supports and connects us rather than detaching us from the in-the-moment experiencing of our lives. Because the truth is, sometimes technology can have that effect, the effect of detaching ourselves from what's going on around us in the physical space and sort of focusing us too much on what's digital, and that can be frightening in a way. But the point is, it doesn't need to be that way at all. In recent research, we've seen that playful technology can also help us to be more present and thrive, whatever it is we're doing individually and socially. And that can happen in many different ways. one of the principal experiential qualities of play is that it can add an element of joy to situations that would otherwise be boring, frustrating, or unstimulating. And that's a pretty obvious one, right? We all think about play in those terms. But it's also a very relevant trait right now when the current pandemic situation tests our emotional state so much. Play can also give us a feeling of agency because it gives us fun opportunities to act in ways that feel very meaningful to us. And if you think about it, this feeling of agency is a very necessary one for humans, and especially scarce in a current society where we're often dependent on very large structures that often, and luckily I would say, disempower us and make us feel small and inconsequential. And finally, but perhaps most importantly, I think today we're seeing a lot about this, play can also create the right conditions for us to connect with other people and share meaningful moments of social connection. All of those values are very consequential to human life, and as such, we argue, I think not only myself, but the rest of the panelists today, we argue that they should be carefully considered in technology design. So in my research, I'm very interested in figuring out how those principles can be incorporated in the interactive technologies that we build. And in particular, I'm currently looking at how those playful potentials can be leveraged in the domain of food practices. How could we leverage playful technology to enrich our food lives socially and emotionally? Because, you know, today we see a lot of this in food settings, but you'll possibly agree with me that this is far more interesting and nice and exciting and rewarding from a socio-emotional perspective. So to enable technology designers to do all they can to ensure that our food futures are as social, playful, and emotionally rewarding as possible, we're currently researching what kinds of mealtime technologies could afford experiences of connected well-being around food. We're working on a project supported by the Google Digital Wellbeing team, where we're co-designing and testing a diverse set of technology concepts and using those explorations as a platform for envisioning what the future of mealtime technology should look like. This is still a work in progress, so I'm afraid I cannot share many conclusive results yet. What I can do is tell you that we're exploring a broad range of technology concepts, including, for example, technology-augmented tableware that acts in crazy ways to break the ice, table centerpieces that facilitate conversations, for example, by providing unexpected conversation topics, objects that encourage people to eat or behave in unconventional ways, or devices that allow people to police each other's antisocial behaviors in playful ways. Today, I won't describe all of those concepts in detail, but I'm happy to talk about them later if you have questions, either in the question and answer section of this panel or in the Mozilla Hubs. But the general idea I want to give you, though, is that by co-designing those concepts with relevant stakeholders, with actual users, and by testing them and seeing what happens when people use these technologies during mealtime, we're collecting about a bunch of insights about what it takes for technology to contribute to food experiences that are social and fun. So yeah, overall, to conclude, my message, the message of this talk would be that there's a lot that play can offer in our lives, and that playful technology designers should think about how play can be a way to enrich rather than disrupt the experiential texture of our mundane activities, because we don't really want a future where screens distract us or ourselves from all that life has to offer, right? I mean, we want a world where technology contributes to enriching the experience of what's already there, the experience of being present in the here and now in ways that we enjoy what surrounds us every day, people, food, and more. So that's what we're working on in our research. And I'll take any questions if people have them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ferran. All right. So those were just the brief provocations from our panelists. So at this point, we would love questions from all of you who are listening. Of course, I did prepare some questions of my own to kind of get things going. I don't see any questions yet. Maybe, Jonathan, you should just confirm with the attendees they're able to pose questions if they like. But I will go ahead and pose a first question. And this is to any of the panelists who'd like to answer. So all of you have focused on playful applications, and I'm sure there are some in our audience who may be working in these spaces commercially or adjacent spaces. Are there guidelines or design directions that any of you would offer to our attendees to meet the needs of their own commercial practice working in this area based on your research?
Yeah, so I can have kind of a partially actionable answer to this. I personally, when as a play designer, when I design a playful intervention, I take into serious account the context and the audience and the type of activity I'm designing for. So yeah, we have plenty of theories and frameworks for designing for play, and they're all super useful. But ultimately, what's most important is the kind of playful experiences that the people we're designing for in the actual activities and design contexts we're targeting, what they like to do in those spaces. So as a play designer and researcher, I tend to sort of immerse myself in those contexts, figure out the types of playful things that they already do, and then just try to make those lovely things that people spontaneously, naturally already do. I try to use technology to help them flourish more, to take place in new and exciting ways. So I think that there's a lot of playful wisdom in people's practices, in people's existing practices, and that's something that as a designer, I really like to leverage.
And you both you and Jared mentioned needing to send things to people and work in different ways in your design practice. So maybe there are recommendations you'd like to share if you feel comfortable about how to make that all work.
Yeah, so I think you're referring to the cultural probes that Ferran and I are sending out to our target populations. And for me, from the therapy standpoint, I have two goals. And the first goal is primarily to give people resources right now for their health and their well-being, because access to that kind of stuff is really difficult with the limited access to medical professionals and reduced health services. So that's priority one, is just giving them tools and resources that they need. But priority two is giving them structures that are sort of open-ended and can be appropriated in whatever way that family thinks is fun. So you can think of, just give people a set of cards with words on them, and then let them create a card game, or let them create some sort of play structure that is really up to the family. And our goal as researchers is to capture just how those things were appropriated to be playful and fun, and then use that to augment our technology and sort of build it, as Ferran was saying, to match the context that the play originally happened in.
Yeah, and as you point out, you know, there may be multiple people in a household. So when we think about the pandemic, it's kind of like, oh, everybody's separated, but no, we're sort of clumpy. And so I was thinking about Elizabeth's talk, and there are, I mean, my family, we're playing board games because we see each other every day, the same people, right? So so with Tabletop Simulator, do people kind of work in the same room and also across the network? Is there that kind of hybrid play going on?
There is a fair bit of that hybrid play. At least I can speak very authoritatively about my own board game experience, but it's very common where a couple or members of a family will be grouped together at one location, and then there'll be another series of users that are alone at several different locations. And I'll be very interested to see, especially with products like Zoom and other sort of video softwares, which are often hand in hand used with these, especially when they're built into the software. Dealing with sound with co-located players is not very easily solved right now. Certainly I've seen some less efficient uses of those sort of situations where people are sharing two different screens but only one mic, which means you one player but not the other. Or you just have people in the same household playing from different rooms, which seems sad to me, but it works better.
You force people apart. Yeah, I think the hybrid setting is one that has been an underexplored use case that we're seeing pop up now, just generally speaking.
Absolutely. And just to the first question really quick, one thing I think will be interesting to see for anyone out there doing these digital board games or physical board game spaces, Murmur's going to join me again, is getting people back from digital to physical after the fact, especially with some of these more complex systems. For example, I've been playing a lot of crunchy board games, that's what I like, but with these additions and these assistive measures, I'm not sure I could play the physical board game without additional instruction. Like I can play Terra Mystica very well on Board Game Arena, but if you put a copy in front of me, I would have to hesitate and reevaluate final scoring rules, for example. So I think there'll be some interesting migration after the pandemic for people who are inspired or meet products for the first time digitally, and then want to buy a sequel or related or an expansion project in the physical world and realize that they don't quite know how to play it as well as they thought.
You know, that weirdly reminds me, I had a colleague in Japan who I asked for directions. He couldn't write the kanji for the place I was going because he always typed the sounds into his keyboard and it would craft the kanji for him. So he'd gotten out of practice of drawing it. So it is true that we definitely adapt to our software augmentations. So there is a question here from one of the attendees, which is, Elizabeth, have you heard about any ways that LARPers have been adapting to physical distancing?
I've been seeing little things pop up here and there, but I look forward to looking into that deeper. I'm seeing a lot of distance theater happening, which is different, but certainly productions that are being either adapted to or written directly for a format like this for video chat. And I imagine there are going to be similar modes of adaptation and introduction of props, lighting, and even the virtual backgrounds that so many of us are using right now that have become a part of performative role-playing as well as theater.
So we touched a little just now on this notion of the augmentation of technology or software. So, and also accessibility came up in Elizabeth's talk. So a question for you all is, where in your experience in working on your projects or thinking about things have you found that tech is most artfully augmenting the experience?
Yeah, one thing that has helped my work a little bit is this idea of being a little bit open-ended and less rigid, letting the tech sort of just naturally be flexible, so that way people can appropriate it for their use case scenario.
Mm-hmm.
Not everything has to be defined, not everything has to be so systematized, because people are really adept at making things work for their use case. So if you kind of leave it open-ended for them, it allows people to enjoy it more, and it allows people to enjoy it in different ways and different contexts that you might not expect. The challenge there becomes studying the thing, because it's so open-ended. It's really hard to understand exactly what's going on with it. So that there is this balance that you have to create.
So flexibility in something, for example, like Spoke It, it's about, you know, which lessons they do or who they're doing it with, or allowing a certain amount of time to go by. What kinds of flexibility?
Yeah, so one way we've made Spoke It a bit more flexible is by adding this ability for a game controller to be connected to the device. And what the game controller does is it simply overrides what the speech recognition would normally be determining. So you can think of cases where the child might not be really engaged in playing the app as is anymore. They don't want to be talking anymore. And a way to re-engage them would be, instead of speaking, go do like a lap around the house or something, do some jumping jacks, go have a snack, and then the facilitator or the adult or the speech language pathologist could then use the controller to have the app respond to whatever mechanics they just created. And all of a sudden, Spoke It is this magical thing that can respond to things other than speech. And they can create different play scenarios and different games even. And that's one way to make it more flexible.
So the facilitator is kind of like the dungeon master. It's kind of able to craft a different on the fly experience for the kid.
Exactly. And it's a way to really personalize it so that the child can kind of see that the Spoke It world is not just in this app anymore. It's sort of this bigger magic circle is what we like to call it sometimes.
Nice. That includes cats.
Yes, the whole family included.
Anything else you'd like to add to that, Ferran?
Yeah, so I think
a lot.
in the food domain, I've sort of seen a similar thing, right? When technology takes too much presence in a food experience, especially in mealtime, for example, what happens with those guys, right? When technology sort of gets in the middle of the nice social set of exchanges that are taking place in mealtime, people get annoyed, and rightfully so. So what we found is that people tend to like using technology for two things, or technology serving two roles. I'm speaking very generally, but one of them is technology allowing them to provide more information that sort of augments the conversation that they're having. So that's something that people naturally do. And then all of a sudden, the use of phones in a conversation feels legitimate, so to speak. And then another interesting way of integrating technology is using it as a way to sort of break the ice or provide conversation topics when there aren't. And that can happen by through the technology actually literally providing a conversation topic, or the technology doing something obnoxious that actually, sort of challenges the situation and makes everyone be like, what the heck is going on? And then they start talking, and then there's, the conversation is flowing again. So again, technology being a resource for people to actually enact their playful social situation rather than technology determining too much what's going on in the social setting. I think it's a good place to start.
Yeah, so I'm seeing a common theme of basically tech in the service of the quality of the social and felt experience, which is a great reason why cats like to sit on computers, right? They don't like the tech getting in the way. Oh, we've got a question. Hang on. I feel like a DJ. So Jared discussed play that is explicitly therapeutic. Do you ever find that you need to make trade-offs between play and therapy, and how do you think about those trade-offs? It's a great question. Oh, you've got to unmute.
Okay, yeah, so I actually have this diagram here from some of the research I've done and the way I think about this. And sorry for the complicated words in here, but paratelic play is basically that open-ended play that children sort of naturally do. It's like tag that can quickly turn into tackling each other, that can quickly turn into a game that includes some like a sports thing, or like with balls or something like that. And that kind of play is naturally therapeutic because it's helping children learn social skills. How hard can I tackle someone where it's still playful, or ouch, this is no longer fun and you actually hurt me. How they're working on their physical abilities, they're exercising. So I would say that general play is naturally healing in a lot of ways. But what happens is if you try to focus that healing onto a specific outcome, let's say speech therapy, all of a sudden you have to operationalize that play, so that way it's focusing on that specific thing. And that moves over to this idea of telic play, or games, where it's very systematic, it's very rigid, and you sort of have these concrete ideas of what the play should look like. Now, I think that trade-off you're talking about is exactly the tricky area where I have that gap illustrated, where it's serious play for health, where it's you create these structures that sort of afford the kind of therapy that you're looking for, but allow the person to sort of create their own play within that space. And the reason for that is if you totally operationalize it, you get what's a serious game for health, which is an awesome field, and I include myself in that field, but a lot of the flexibility is gone, and a lot of the play affordances are gone, right? A lot of the things that make play spontaneous and sometimes evil and sometimes social, and all of those trade-offs, as soon as you systemize something, can go away, right? You can make a social serious game for health, but it's kind of harder to predict and all that kind of stuff. So to answer your question, yes, there are lots of trade-offs. When you start doing more open-ended play for therapy, it's harder to study. It's harder to measure the outcomes. It's harder to understand how it's working in the real world. And it's harder to prove to clinical people that your therapy is actually working. But what I would argue is, let's say even if the therapy is less effective than a clinical intervention, what you do get is more time working on the therapy, which over time might improve your adherence to working on your therapy, because play is more fun than regular therapy. So I hope that answers your question.
So there was one last question I prepared before we kind of seg over to trying out hubs as a form of informal chatting, which is just, we don't know how long we're going to be in this strange time when we're all meeting in this weird way. And obviously you all did research before this, and you'll do research after. So I think it might be interesting for the attendees to hear your reflections about like which parts of what you're seeing now you think will carry forward and why.
Well, I think that there's an element of making people who are far away sort of feel closer. And I can speak from my personal experience, right? So I'm a person I was born in Barcelona, raised there. A lot of my family is there, most of it, and many of my friends are there, though I have friends scattered around the world. And for a long time, as a person who's living abroad, I've been this guy who's away from like the bigger social group that I had there. But all of a sudden, we were all in quarantine. So kind of the playground sort of leveled, and we were all in the same position. And that paradoxically made me feel much more connected those days. I mean, not in a general sense, but in that particular part of my life or social circle, I was much more connected because everyone was okay with being online. So there's something about creating spaces, digital spaces for connecting people who are not necessarily physically together, because that's a reality that we have right now, and possibly it's going to be more and more so in the future. So not everywhere, not all the time, but creating safe spaces for people to feel connected when they can't be physically together. I think that's a big lesson that we can learn from this sort of research design experience that we have right now.
Nice. Elizabeth and Jared, anything you'd like to add?
The only thing I have to add is I think working on these telehealth solutions there's a big push for it right now because it's a sort of a necessity at the moment. And I think there's a lot of benefits to games for therapy because there's a lot of data being collected, a lot of sensors are being pushed to like be able to grade and critique. And I think it's much more scalable way of thinking about healthcare. And when used in tandem with medical professionals, giving medical professionals access to the reports and things like that, it might create healthcare solutions that are a bit more scalable and equitable, especially to people who don't typically have access to a lot of this stuff. So I think that's one really nice thing that could carry over is giving people who generally don't have access to therapy normally now may have a cheaper option.
Well, and the pandemic forced billing to change. So the insurers actually abruptly started allowing telemedicine. So that was good. We all hope that switch doesn't get flipped back, I suppose.
Exactly, yeah.
There was one other question. Elizabeth, did you want to add anything here?
Yeah, I think part of it was addressing this latest question, just emphasizing, I think, one major weakness of some of these more social, more playful applications is in sound, and not just in mixed hybrid environments where some people are together and some people are apart, but also as described in this question, as soon as you get to a certain number of people, just doing volume control, you can't have that easy aside to someone while another conversation's still going on. So now that we've got video conferencing, I think we're doing pretty well on that in general. We've got that technology, it's working okay. I would love to see some more nuanced approaches to sound design for virtual spaces and thinking about how to make those accessible to a large intergenerational audience.
So that's such an elegant segue into our strange experimental little after party from this event. So originally we were going to have the whole event in this room that you're going to try in a moment. But what we realized it's kind of a processor hog. And that is true for a lot of these virtual spaces. So we thought, you know what, we'll start with the Zoom webinar, but then we're going to offer people a chance to hop off. So this is that moment. We're going to move over to our Mozilla Hubs room. Now, Jonathan already shared this link, hopefully with you all via email, and he's going to post the link in chat in a moment as well. And he also sent out a controls website to help you navigate, and he's going to paste that here too. But before we go there, because I know some of you may just hop off and go, have your happy hour and head off into your weekend, I just wanted to thank you for attending this panel and to offer that this isn't the only one. We'll have more, so stay tuned to our social media channels, and Jonathan will paste those here in the chat to learn about upcoming virtual panels and work that we've got going on.